So you can move that camera closer in, just move it to your right.
Justice Earls, can you hear us okay?
That's a better screen.
Yes, I can hear everyone. Can you all hear me?
Wonderful. We can.
Okay,
And I think
Well, I apologize for the slight delay in getting logged in, but I'm gonna kick us off. And I have the exciting prospect of being in the room with Jasmine and Nisha Williams. So we are all gonna be joining you on this one screen. And I want to welcome everyone. I think I heard that my co-chair, Secretary Buffalo, is on by phone. Is that right?
Yes, Justice Earl, I'm here. Sorry I can't be with y'all with video this morning.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much for being able to participate. And please do not hesitate to jump in if there's something I forget or more you want to add. And I just really appreciate you taking the time, allowing us to move forward today. We have a really exciting program for our meeting. And I want to start by letting everyone on the task force know that the governor has graced us with filling the task force now with a final appointment. Jamie Markham, I think you're here. Can you just introduce yourself to all the task force members?
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Justice Earls. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
we can.
No, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I've presented to different parts of the task force in my former role at UNC at the School of Government, but it's exciting to be on this side of things, and I'm honored to be a part of it. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And so now, so our meeting today will primarily be us receiving information, both from an amazing expert who's going to talk with us for the bulk of our meeting, but then we also have an opportunity to hear brief reports from the committees, to hear what's been going on since our last meeting. And we do have one member of the public who's signed up to give us some public comment. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. So Thaddeus Johnson is an assistant professor of criminal justice and criminology at Georgia State University's Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. He's an expert in policing, crime control, governance equity. He's conducted extensive research on police lethality and coercion, street violence, recidivism, algorithmic and predictive bias, and congressional control. He's also the author or co-author of numerous articles and reports on a number of relevant topics, and his research has been featured in national media. He's written widely on police and justice reform issues, and he is joined by Dr. William Sebol. He is a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Georgia State University. He teaches and conducts research on corrections, sentencing policy, and crime statistics. And during the past 30 years, he's held positions in government, private sector research institutions, and universities, including serving as director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So we are really fortunate to have them with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you to make a presentation to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice Earls, for the great, wonderful introduction, and thank you all for having us in the invitation. Bill and I, this is a lot of work that we do. This last report that we worked with the Council on Criminal Justice, Bill led the report on understanding what the disparities look like. How are we measuring disparity? What does that measurement mean? And just really across the board, what are some of the mechanisms underneath the general imprisonment disparity that we see nationally? We started doing some work at the state level. Unfortunately, North Carolina wasn't a state that was on our list. will be and can be to work with you all. But we're really happy to be here with you. Bill, do you have anything you want to say before we get going? All right, sounds good. Bill, we go back and forth, and I know it says Dr. William Sable and Dr. Thaddeus Johnson. We're just Thad and Bill. All right, so just let's govern ourselves that way. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I know we have a short time, and there's a lot of stuff to cover. And whenever Bill and I are putting together these presentations, we're always like, my God, like it's we uncover these rabbit holes and we go down more and more, and it's like, man, this is important and this is important. So we're going to really try to streamline and hit the highlights of what was going on nationally and how we tried to investigate what was going on at the state levels, and trying to see both, what was going on with reform, with laws and statutorily, but also trying to get an idea some of our other work, what's going on non-statutorily in practice, what's going on in communities. The one thing that you will see is that when we're talking, we talk about racial disparities in imprisonment since 2000, we've seen historic declines when it comes to drug offenses. But right now, the leading cause of disparity in imprisonment has to do with violent offenses. And so pretty much the theme of the day is that justice and improved public safety is a justice matter. And so that's kind of the spirit in which we want to enter today's presentation. So let's get started. There's a couple of key takeaways that we kind of all want you to go away with. And I know you all are pretty much familiar with a lot of these terminologies, but I don't want to take that for granted. We're going to use terms like 8-to-1, 5-to-1, and these things. We're discussing disparity ratios, and how we got that disparity ratio. We took the number of this is race specific, of those in prison in state prisons, and divided that number by the adult population in those adult population, and multiplied it by 100,000 to give us the rate per 100,000 adults. And we simply divided the Black imprisonment rate by the white imprisonment rate to get an understanding of the disparity. And so when we say things like 5-to-1, that means that the Black imprisonment rate is 5 times higher than that of the white imprisonment rate. Okay. So since 2000, the racial disparity in Black-white adult imprisonment, it fell from about 8 to 5-to-1. And again, as I said, this decrease is unprecedented historically. And this decrease was led by changes, like I said, in drug imprisonment. And also, we'll talk about between 2000 and 2019, the change in disparity wasn't uniform. It fluctuated. It went up and down before it led to the final decrease. And we'll talk about that. Admissions, even though length of stay, its contribution to disparity increased over time, admission still accounts for most of the disparity. We'll also talk about, we know that people just don't walk into prison themselves. And we talk about how the justice system is highly decentralized, but they are admitted into prison by way of arrest. And so it's important that even though these systems are highly decentralized, it's important that we understand that the cumulative effects on people in real life are real. And lastly, the offender rate differences explain most of the current level of disparity for violent offenses. And we really want to drive that point home, because at the end of the day, if we want to continue to reduce disparities in imprisonment, we have to address differences, racial differences, and violent offending. It's bigger than treatment, is what we're finding out, differential treatment. I keep pushing the plus sign. So let's get started real quickly. Also, I grew up in the Black church, in Memphis, Tennessee. And so if I start taking too long, they usually, the deacons will pull their coattail, right? Like, shut up and sit down. So somebody, please, as we start running short on time, please pull the proverbial coattail as we're talking. As you'll see, let's dig in. On the left and the right-hand sides, you'll see the disparity ratios and the underlying imprisonment rates. We're starting this presentation starting from 2000, but it's important to see the shaded area to the right, to the left, because, there's issues in how we historically have measured race and ethnicity in the US, and it could have implications for resources and things and how we measure now. Maybe we can come, that's another time for another conversation. But what we saw was between 2000 and 2020, the relative Black-white adult disparity ratio declined by roughly 40% in imprisonment. In 2000, the imprisonment rate for Black adults were about 8 times higher than the imprisonment rate for white adults in prisons and state prisons. Now, and 20 years later, Black people still remain about 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white counterparts. If you look to the right-hand side, you'll see that the Black imprisonment rate fell almost continuously throughout the period, dropping nearly 50%. When it comes comparative to the white imprisonment rate, it fell roughly 10%, and you see that here as well. Yeah. Now we talk about disparity. We're talking in terms in general of relative disparity, but you'll hear two terms: relative and absolute disparity. And I will not go into a lecture on those differences and why those things are so utterly important. But it kind of affirms that what we're seeing mathematically is really happening in real life, and that there's two different ways to measure disparity. And so what we saw was that about half the drop, if you're noticing, the left-hand side is disparity ratios. With the blue line and the red line on the left-hand side is a difference in rates. So what you'll notice is about half the drop in the black-white disparity occurred from 2000 to 2005, and the remainder happened 2006 on. From 2000 to 05, the black-white disparity ratio fell about 1.6 points, roughly from 8.2 to 6.6 times, 6.6 to 1. Then from 2006 onward, it fell another 1.7 points, from 6.6 to 1 to 4.9 to 1. Now, what does this mean? This means that roughly the same decrease in disparity seen in the first 5 years of the study period, it took an additional 15 years to achieve the same level of drop in disparity. And the main reason for this change in pacing is that from 2000 to 05, the white imprisonment rate, if you look right here on the right-hand side, the white imprisonment rate increased as the black rate decreased. And then between 2006 and 2020, the white rate decreased even as the black rate decreased more rapidly than it did. And so basically you saw a difference in the latter end because the black rate was decreasing at a much faster pace than the white rate was. That's in simple terms. And look, we saw these changes not only for a total imprisonment, but we saw this across the board. Now, imprisonment gap or the racial gap in imprisonment shrunk across all offense categories. The black-white disparity in drug imprisonment rates fell by 75% from 15 to 1 in 2000 to just under 4 to 1 at 3.6 to 1 in 2019. Also, for violent offenses, the black-white disparity fell about a quarter, from 8.3 to 6.2. And then for property offenses, the imprisonment rate disparity nearly halved over the study period, from 5.3 to 2.9. Now, I won't get into all these specifics, but I think it's important to also note that we're not trying to right now explain what's behind the changes in the rates. We're just getting to understand what's going on. But we'll be remiss if we didn't point out that the change in the white imprisonment rates for drug offenses were cyclical. If you look at, can you see this one right here, this quadrant here? And then they increased from 2000 to 2005, then decreased through 2008, and then it rose again through 2020. That's a lot. What does all this mean? What we found was that the changes in the white imprisonment rate for drug offenses, they actually correspond with increases in the use of methamphetamines during the early 21st century and the growth in the use of opioids, such as heroin and fentanyl, around 2013. And I want to get, we all know, what historically has been considered to be black drugs, quote unquote, and historically what's been considered to be white drugs. And that's what we're starting to see, changes in those trends that may explain some of the difference we see in the white drug imprisonment rate. Now, today we talk a lot about rates and all and ratios. But what happens is if we don't really look at counts, it causes us to dehumanize the data. But we have to remember that behind these numbers are people, our souls, our lives. And so our job when we're dealing with inequity and looking at data is to understand this is not a number 200, for instance, with violent prisoners in year 2000 for Blacks right here. That's not just, a data point 281,000. That's 281,000 lives and people. And so really wanted to drive that point home. You'll also see that in 2000, look at violent offenders, since that's a thing. There's more people in prison in 2019 than in 2000 for violent offenses. And we see the same thing for white prisoners between 2000 and 2019. We're starting to see increases when it comes to violence. Now, if you stay on the right column and you look for drugs, you see there was an increase across time for drugs, and that goes along with what we were saying. But for blacks, we see with drugs, there was a decrease. And so we're having these changes that are going along in our justice system. This is why it's important to break down by offense category. And also it's important to look at counts as well and break down the counts and rates, because, oftentimes when I remember this report first came out, people were claiming victory. Oh, the justice system is doing everything that they're doing. And what we found out was that half of the change in disparity didn't have anything to do with the justice system. It was about secular changes. And if you look here at the population rate, for instance, the population growth for black people during this time was about 33%. So the number of black people in the US was 33% higher in 2019 than it was in 2000. For white people, that was 7.2%. And so you can see how these things can offset, and you can read the words at the bottom, how it can kind of play around and can create these measures that we see. And this is why we say it's so important to really understand what that one disparity ratio number, what it really means. And so you'll see that, for instance, the black population increased by 33%, but faster than the growth in the number of black persons in prison for violent offenses. And you see the same, and you see the white adult population increased by 7%, and it's more slowly than the change of people incarcerated for violent offenses. So it's just really trying to get an understanding of what's going on mathematically before we start talking about policy recommendations and things of that sort. Now let's kind of get into the theme of this. We talk about, who are we incarcerating? Are we incarcerating lower level offenders, or are we focusing on more serious offenders? Well, what we see is that the majority of shares of both black and white persons in prison for violent offenses, I think it's a number of 2/3 or so. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's something like that. That's who are in our state prisons right now. I will get to the point when we start talking about why we can't incarcerate ourselves out of the violent crime issues that we have. And unless we address the violent crime issues in these communities, we'll continue to have disparities when it comes to offending and violent imprisonment. And as you see right now, the one area that we're struggling with the most when it comes to inequitable incarceration, for lack of better terms, is with our violent offenders. Now, again, the majority of violent offense and prison disparity is explained by disparity in violent offending rates. I'm going to come back to that, because when we start talking about those things, it's important that we provide it in context. Particularly when we start talking about that, as you'll see the next slide, that the disparities that we may see in arrests, those are explained by disparities in offending, not necessarily disparities or differential treatment, as we've accepted to be the case with drug offenses and property crime and other offenses as well. It's a whole different ballgame, and other things are going on that we need to address. Remember, improved public safety is a justice matter. All right, so you'll see in 2000, about 40% of the black-white violent offense imprisonment disparity could be explained by differences in offending rates, and this is based on NCVS, National Criminal Victimization Survey. In 2019, that number jumped up to about 55% could be explained by estimated differences in offending. Also to note, black adults arrested for violent crime across the study period were also 60% more likely than white people to be sentenced to prison. And on the last slide, you'll see how, we talked about time served and admissions and all these things, but we know that violent crime comes with longer sentences. And so again, it's all connected and revolves around violent offending. It's important to note as well that if you look on the right-hand column before I move on, that these lines converge, meaning that the disparity in arrests, when you do it per violent offense, has almost reached parity, meaning that it's not necessarily inequitable arrests. It's the offending aspect that we need to cover. And this brings me to a specific point, and we'll talk about this in depth about the systemic inequities that underpin this. But if we want to impact violent offending disparities, impact the violent imprisonment for violent offenses, this is where it's at. And we have to take both a statutory and non-statutory approach that we'll talk about later on, a holistic approach that holds offenders accountable, but also a system that salvages people and see the beauty in rehabilitation, and not a system that simply destroys people's lives and trajectories. That's the spirit of this conversation. And so I want you all also to know that when it comes to violent crime, maybe with the exception of robbery, there are some differences, but most violent crimes, the victim and offender are often of the same race and generally the same social background. All right. And if you look at this victimization race by race between 2000 and 2020, and this is drawn from the Centers on Disease Control data, we see that across time, Black people have been about 5 times more likely to be homicide victims. And that number jumped up in 2020 to right about 6 times more likely to be victims of homicide. I think it's also important to note that during the pandemic is where we saw this big jump. And it kind of changed the game for us, right? How we think about justice, how we think about treatment, how we think about enforcement. Just know that this violent crime affected all demographics, but especially Black communities. In many of your larger cities, the violent increase was only felt in Black and brown communities. And so during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, we saw an average of 10 more Black lives lost each day to homicide compared to the year before. During this same period, the average number of white homicide victims increased by nearly 5 per day. When you start thinking about representation, it becomes even more sobering. And then the increase was not even distributed evenly across Black communities. You know, most Black homicide victims were young males, and the CDC estimates that Black men ages 15 to 34 represented about a third of all U.S. homicide deaths in 2021. There is a real issue going on. And remember, improving public safety is a justice matter. These slides are particularly important because oftentimes we talk about targeted intervention, right? The things that we need to reduce the gap in offending. And I know these are a lot of numbers. I'm an AAK professor, and you have to forgive me. And I will make this slide available for you all with notes and these different resources for you all to have at your access, but also to make sure to know that we weren't making these things up, that they come from somewhere. All right. You know, we generally talk about young Black males. And we know that, you know, the higher prevalence of violent crime is among this group. But the one group that we don't talk about are women oftentimes. They get left out the conversation. And if you look at the difference between 2019 and 2021, and I use that because 2019 is really our pre-pandemic crime market. It's a great benchmark, right? We see that across the board for males, we saw decreases of non-significant increases. But look at women. Between 2019 and 2021, you have 20% greater number of women who were robbery victims. Black women, 17% succumbed to aggravated assault. And then with white females, you know, yeah, aggravated assault didn't jump up high, but these are things that we're not talking about. What's going on? So these are some matters of intervention that are really, we deemed as important. And yes, we talk about lethal violence, and I'll move on because I feel like I'm beating the dead horse and I'm gonna pull my own coattail. But Black Americans are also twice as likely to report receiving medical treatment for injuries sustained from an assault. And so even though we focus on lethal violence and these types of offenders, it's much more prevalent, the other types of violent offending that we see. Oh, hold on, sorry, did I mess something up? All right, here we go. So the size of the prison population is a function of the number of persons admitted into prison and how long they stay there. All right, so we're turning back into the admissions because these trends that we see with violent crime, also violent offending and the gap in imprisonment, it follows all the way through admissions and follows all the way through length of stay as a driver underneath. So as we'll see, admissions exerted a downward influence on the Black-white imprisonment rate. And if you look to the left-hand side, the green line represents the disparity ratio between the two. The blue line is for the Black race, and the red line is for the white race. And what you see that during the span, Black-white adult admissions rate fell by half, while the white admission rates increased by about 11%. This led to a 57% decrease in the black-white racial disparity ratio in emissions, overall emissions, which fell from about 7.4 to 1 to roughly 3 to 1. But if we look on the right-hand side, remember, emissions or length of stay can exert an upward or downward influence on disparity. And so we see that the length of stay changes exerted an upward influence on black-white imprisonment. So if you look to the right, we see that the expected length of stay for Black adults increased from 26.4 months to roughly 30 months, while for white adults, it fell from 24 months to around 21.6 months. And it's just kind of showing the underlying aspects of it. Now, let me say this: we did look at parole revocations and probation violations and things like this. That's a much less common way to get into prison nowadays. We saw declines in the disparity ratio, declines in the rates, but it only contributed marginally anyway to the admissions disparity and overall disparity. And so what the main driver of what we see in disparity gap in admissions is new court commitments. I know we all talk about recidivism so much, but new court commitments, these new crimes that people are coming in on, is really a big issue that we're seeing when it comes to disparity. As you look, let's just look at the two and three graphs. You'll see that the admissions per new court admissions or new court commitments per arrest converge for property and drug offenses, but not for violent offenses. How we calculated this number, we simply took the number of new court commits and divided it by the number of arrests, times 1,000. All right. Black adults arrested for violent crime across the study period again were 66% more likely to be sent to prison. And that's the very first column that you see. So you see convergence for property offenses and drug offenses, and you see this divergence of sorts when it comes to violent offenses and new court commissions. And again, parole revocations are a much less common pathway today into prison as it was in 2000. This kind of shows the disparity. We looked at the rates first, but this is kind of the disparity of what these rates equate to. So on the right-hand side, you see disparities in arrest rates between Black and white people. On the left-hand side, you see the ratio of new court commitments per arrest. And what you see is that, again, right here, the new court commitments per arrest for property and drug offenses approach 1, a parity. That problem that we have, violent offending. And this occurred the same place you see here. The problem is still with violent offending. Again, remember, racial differences in offender rates for violent crimes were associated with racial differences in arrest. All right, take a breath, take a sip. Now we looked at the overall national level imprisonment. Now, what's going on in the states, right? That's underpinned these national trends. So I first want to start with this, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague after a couple of slides to discuss what we've done looking at state level statutory changes and reform. But this is important to look at. Don't worry about the right-hand side. I wanted us to hone in on the left-hand side here. Now, this is the share at the bottom, the state share contributions to national level imprisonment for race-specific rates. This axis represents your disparity ratio. So this is like 5 to 1, 10 to 1, and so forth. These are the shares. So meaning that the more people that are incarcerated in states, the larger share contributes nationally, they tend to be more fair, and the census tend to be a little bit more equal, as you see as we move along this line here. But look, the ones who incarcerate only a small proportion or contribute a small proportion to the overall national trends, those are where we see the most problems when it comes to disparity. And so, this is one thing that Bill and I kind of threw around. I don't know if playfully is the right word, but You know, people are like, what's a quick way to reduce disparity? I'm sorry. I saw that somebody have a question. I thought I heard something. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. So yeah. So what time is it? 10:30. Yeah, I have about. I promise to be done in about another 10 minutes. And so basically, what we tend to say is that, you know, if you want more equity, look at the states who punish everybody more harshly. They seem to, at least in those states, seem to be more fair in how they dish out their punishments. That's something we're still looking at, but we thought that was an intriguing point to see. And this also raises a study of the question about the focus on equity of persons affected when we have policy choices. For instance, and I'm just maybe making these numbers up, and Bill, hop in if I'm wrong, but say a place like Vermont or New Hampshire, where they have smaller populations, they may have a higher disparity rate, but there's fewer people who actually contribute to the national rates. Or a place like Texas or something who incarcerates many more people, but we see that when they incarcerate many more people, it's lives impacted. So are we focused on simply equity, persons affected, or some combination of the both? And when we're making policies recommendations, sometimes we can't address just one thing with one simple policy. And so it may take a suite of policies, but it's things to really think about and consider. We're going to talk about moving forward real quickly before we go. One thing that I know you all are interested in: what have states been doing? What have governments been doing? Localities been doing? And we want to cover some of these things real quickly before someone pulls my coattail. We're looking at with our work with CC, the Council on Criminal Justice. We're looking at 12 states, a sample of 12 states, and we just finished the first bundle of states. And so what we found is that, remember I said, if we want to further reduce disparities in imprisonment, we have to focus on violent offending. And so we were kind of looking across these statutory changes, and what were the themes? What was the focus? And so they slightly differ across the states. We've officially finished 4. We probably got it through about 8. And I'll tell you right now, provisionally, these are the main themes throughout, where people focused on treatment programming and risk assessments. You also saw where they made adjustment to criminal justice actors' discretionary authority. Sometimes they increased that authority, and sometimes they minimize that authority, depending on the different types of statutes. We also saw adjustments to sentencing severity adjustments, whether making them more severe or less severe. And in some places, we even saw that they created new tiers for crime offenses to try to be more accurate and charging, have the laws more accurately depict behaviors that we see in society. Also saw good time and early release provisions across the board. And then we also saw an emphasis on repeat offenders and habitual offenders in these statutes. Now, again, these statutory changes did not really focus on violent offending. And when they did, they impacted small and very specific groups among the states examined. For instance, we saw this, I believe this is New York. This is Georgia, it's one of the states, I'm confused now, but those convicted of murder may now be sentenced to life without parole as opposed to just life imprisonment. Or you had another one where the judge can depart from the mandatory minimum for a serious felony when the prosecution and defense agree to a sentence below the mandatory minimum. And so these, for violent offender, was very specific, and it impacted a relatively small number of those incarcerated. All right. Bill, it's okay if no, you jump in here, I'll shut up for a minute. And the one thing that we want to talk about in particular, and I'm not going to steal Bill's thunder, is like, what are we seeing? Are we seeing that statutes are leading change, or have these statutes been a result of changes already happening? Bill, you want to, and I'll control the slides for you.
Thanks, Thaddeus. Yeah, echoing Thaddeus's point, we're trying to understand the relationship between statutory reforms and imprisonment disparities. So as a starting point, we gathered data on the over time on reforms across all states from 2000 through 2020. And this top set of slides focuses on drug reforms. Now, we didn't, in this case, distinguish between the types of drug reforms. We just counted. So on the left-hand side, what's shown in the blue line is the black drug imprisonment rate. And in the green line and red line, those are counts of drug reforms, many of which lessen penalties. Some may have increased them. The difference between the green and red line is the green line is when states first implemented reform. The red line is some states came back over the period and implemented a second reform. So you can see this big increase in the mid 2000s in the number of reforms that were implemented. And so if we look at the disparity ratio, we see a couple of things. As Thaddeus pointed out, in the early part of the period from 2000 to 2008, that decreased when there wasn't much reform activity going on. But in the latter part of the period, it continued to decrease with reform activity. So there seems to be some relationship perhaps between drug reforms and black-white disparity. The story is more complicated on the right side, where we have the reforms in the same lines and the white imprisonment rate, that cyclical one that Thaddeus talked about earlier, is shown. And just look to the, if you look to the left, you see that's going up before reform, but during the reform period, it actually started to increase a little bit in the latter part of the reform. So it kind of raises the question, well, are reforms responsible for the increase in the white imprisonment rate, or is something else going on beyond that that needs more explanation? And the next slide then, this is an example on the left of New York, which gets at some of the complications. So in 2020, or 20, I'm sorry, Georgia.
Sorry, Bill, I went on for, this is Georgia, sorry.
Yeah, Georgia. In Georgia, Georgia in 2020 implemented kind of an omnibus bill that was part of its justice reinvestment effort that covered lots of things, including sentences for drug felonies. And we took the example of marijuana possession and analyzed it. And on the left-hand side shows the number of white drug admits for marijuana possession. On the right-hand side shows the number of black drug admits for marijuana possession. These are per month over long periods of time. And you can see when you compare the red lines that there's not much change for whites, but for black drug admits, there's a big increase. So this is kind of an example of, well, reform seems to have contributed to a big change in the number of marijuana felony possession admissions, and that would contribute to a reduction in disparity, keeping in mind that these are monthly counts and the total number per year don't add up. The net effect is kind of small, but it is an indication that reforms can lead to reductions in disparity. On the right-hand side is the life without parole issue that Thaddeus mentioned. And here, before and after reform, the white admissions are given in blue, and the black admissions are given in dark red or cranberry color. And you can see that the white admissions for murder with a sentence of life without parole were trending upward in the start of the period. And then there was a bump up at the reform, but their trend was pretty similar to the pre-reform trend. For black admissions, the trend in life without parole was kind of flat before reform, but after reform, it's pretty equal to the trend for white admissions. So this is an interesting one because this actually contributes to disparity, but it also demonstrates some equal treatment outcomes that Thaddeus has been talking about before. And the third example on the next slide is New York. So this echoes his point about leadership and cementing or confirmation. New York in 29 passed some bills that kind of address those longstanding Rockefeller drug laws. And look to the right because the right side, it covers what's in the left side. We were interested in the same issue that we found with Georgia, where we found, look, a change in admissions that followed the implementation of the law. And what the right-hand side shows is this drop in Class B drug possession offenses And that's any kind of possession, not just marijuana, it could be crack, could be cocaine and so on, that the admissions fell 3 years before the law was implemented. And then post-law, there's not much change. That slight upward trend is not like statistically significant or anything like that. But this is an example in our way of viewing the world of law cementing or reaffirming stuff that was in practice. And I mean, that's a good thing because it kind of cements it. But there's a difference between, say, the Georgia law, which caused an effect, and the New York law, which cemented practice. And we're seeing these kinds of things, which just makes it very complicated to understand how to understand policy changes and their impacts on disparity. And I'll turn it back to Thaddeus.
No, thanks so much, Bill, for that. You definitely did more eloquently than I could. Did a better service. I have a couple more slides, literally, and I just want to say that the one thing that we saw, because we looked at Colorado and some other places, and generally what we see is that even if it doesn't, these changes are not associated with a decrease or significant reductions in disparity, they didn't tend to add to disparity. And and for Bill and I, we thought that was good news, right? Because it means that at the very least, things in practice were going on already. We cemented it with law, and now it means that at least we have a more equitable baseline to move from with these laws. And so when you start moving to these more non-statutory things that we're going to talk about now, you give these efforts a fighting chance to take a lasting impact. So I want to spend the last 5 minutes or so just really talking about moving forward and how can we further reduce the imprisonment disparity. As I said, the racial disparity in imprisonment is largely driven by differential offending. And we cannot reduce these disparities unless we reduce disparity in race of violent offending, disparity in prison time served, and the role in criminal history and sentencing and release decisions. But mind you, they're all connected. And so this is a policy priority, is reducing disparity means reducing disparity in violent offending and victimization. Now, just want you to bear with me. The evidence suggests that Black Americans both commit and suffer the disproportionate bulk of serious violent crimes, both non-lethal and lethal. Now, I want us to be sure that we don't misconstrue this as meaning that Black people are inherently more violent or that Black communities are broken, all right? No, what this does demonstrate, and it reflects the structural and economic barriers that Black Americans continue to face. And these are the things that we need to address. These are racial gaps rooted in legacies of systemic racism and discrimination that leave Black people with disproportionately less wealth and education, lower access to healthcare, and lengthier criminal histories. I mean, there is some research that even shows that, hell, the air that Black people breathe in many of their communities, Black and poor people, is much more polluted than the air in other areas. And so it shows these systemic issues. Think about, and it also research shows that air pollution can have an impact on brain effects, cognitive effects, which can also be related to violent crime. Also think about the children in these environments, the disproportionate risk of developmental issues that are often associated with delinquency and depression and self-harm, all right? And so research shows that we need to target these dynamic risk factors, right? Like employment and substance abuse and these things to help increase the successful outcomes for rehabilitation and things of that sort. So this is what we're saying. We have slides at the end, we talk about policing. Community safety involves policing. And police violence and mistrust with citizens and police does have an impact on community violence. And we're not getting to those things, but I want you to know that, we have to take a holistic approach if we want sustainable public safety benefits. And we have to also hold offenders accountable, but also address the reasons behind violence and crime. And so this is improved healthcare access, improved housing. We don't have time to talk today, but Bill's been working with the SCA aspects and all of these things that we look for. It comes back to simply things like housing, or how can individuals who've been incarcerated, mind you, they're returning to the communities that they came from, oftentimes with a little bit of clothes on their back, having credit, being able to be part of the capitalistic market. It's hard to reintegrate people, and this is from work we've done before, when they've been socially excluded from the first place. And so we have to take that mindset when it starts talking about, remember, improved public safety is an equity matter. So, Bill, I did put the slide back in, but I think it's important to note this, that we can arrest our way or incarcerate our way out of this problem, right? In fact, when you think about communities and families who have a loved one who's incarcerated, the family disruption, the loss of income, also communities that are characterized with high levels of imprisonment and recidivism are also characterized by abject poverty, the lack of resources. No, those things, you have more liquor stores than you do libraries, these types of things. And so stricter penalties only temporarily stop criminals from victimizing communities. And it suggests to remember, people tend to age out of crime. This is some reasons why it doesn't necessarily work. And we have to do more than just lock people up. People tend to age out of crime. That's why you see a diminishing effect or diminishing returns oftentimes when it comes to longer sentences or on behavioral aspects. And it's a relatively small share of people, or habitual chronic offenders, who's responsible for a disproportionate share of crime. And this is why you have to take a targeted approach when you're talking about engaging the community and community safety. And finally, if we don't address these issues in the community, the root causes of crime, you have the replacement effect that diminishes the impact of incarceration, where if you lock up one offender, a gang member or a drug dealer, somebody else is going to take their place. And I often joke with my students that, hell, if I'm an offender, I'm like, good job, Mr. Policeman. I may call myself because they've done my job for me. And so we have to figure out ways to cut the snake off at the head, for lack of better terms. And so this is another policy consideration. There is no clear-cut evidence that locking up offenders and throwing away the key alone provides lasting public safety benefit, particularly if we're trying to remember admissions and length of stay, which we believe is associated with violent crime. If we continue to take this approach, we're only to see increases. And remember, again, I keep driving this home, improved public safety is an equity matter. Now, our last slide, and I won't spend too much time on these things, but a quick couple of points. Remember, things are already happening in the community on the ground and in practice. Many of the work that you all are doing that we see being cemented with statutory change. And so we also need statutory backing, but you have to look and invest in these things on the street besides law enforcement, right? So for instance, we see in places like Oakland, they combine focused police efforts, policing. And it's not a false choice. We got to have one or the other. You have to have both. Have broad-ranging and policing with broad-ranging outreach and social supports to enhance trust in the system. You enhance trust in the system, people are more likely to comply with the law. More people are more likely to help police in investigations. Maybe they'll even help with some of the abysmal clearance rates that we see in many of our urban areas across the U.S. You also have the Ready Intervention Program in Chicago that focuses on the most highly at-risk individuals for gun violence. And they have these different therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, personal development services, and these types of things. And we saw declines in gun violence and victimization among these people, as well as Men of Valor in Nashville. This is a faith-based in-care, aftercare programming. And if you want to have a successful programming when it comes to recidivism and re-entry, it has to have both an in-care component, in custody, and an aftercare component. And the Men of Valor have seen great improvements among their participants. And the last thing, I won't spend too much time on it, but the Eastlake Atlanta Project, this is a prime example of improving community efficacy, where they had a community where, for lack of better terms, the police back in the 70s used to call it Little Vietnam or a war zone, because the police didn't want to go on these communities. They had more liquor stores than grocery stores, food deserts. The schools were some of the poorest performing. The housing was abject. But this was federal involvement as a funder, state involvement, nonprofits, developers, philanthropists came together and took on this project. And now you know the day, I mean, hell, a couple of years ago, Tiger Woods was there for a major PGA tournament. They have one of the better schools in Atlanta in that area with Drew Trotter School. They have affordable housing. They have grocery stores now that they can walk to and get to. And they have healthcare services. They have minor medical services in these communities. But this is the last thing where I'm going to close my hat on. This is the problem that we saw. And remember, I asked in the slide at first, and I don't know if I had it up here or not, are we going to improve community efficacy, or are we going to focus also on improving the efficacy of those individuals? What we saw with Eastlake was that overnight, in the span when these things were going on, the community got whiter and they became much more educated. It wasn't enough time for those residents to go through their process. And so these residents were sent to other places, but they never made it back. So what happened? We invested in those communities, but what happened to those people who were probably more at risk? And so when we make these investments, let's not just focus on place. We need to also make investments in people. I am done. I will shut up, and we're looking forward to hearing your questions, concerns, and comments, and also learning from what you all are doing in North Carolina as well. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. We do want to open it up, so please, if you have a question, you can either unmute and just wave at us, or you can use the raise hand function. Okay, go ahead. That's. I'm going to start with Tally Wells. I think you raised your hand first. Tally, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm sorry for the groovy music in the background. All right. So I was interested, you know, we're a pretty red to purple state. And just as you've looked at the various states and you specifically mentioned Georgia, and I've got a fair amount of sort of experience with what they did in Georgia, but are there states that you would give as good examples of where they've done some good legislation and work where there are Republicans sort of in a lot of the leadership places?
You know, that's a really good question. And I know Bill May can speak more on this a little bit, but I will say, you know, Georgia is a prime example where, you know, you had Nathan Deal, and we often think that, you know, for some reason we think that you can't be conservative on the right side and not be compassionate, right? Not understand reform. The keynote is accountability. What can be the offset or the bring in. And so I think that the state of Georgia has done many great things when it comes to trying to reinvest in the communities, trying to reduce the impacts of minor offenses like marijuana. You know, we saw that in the city of Atlanta, how they realized that, you know, making these arrests had no public safety benefit. And Bill, tell me if I'm wrong, like at some point in recent time, it may be the same that on the risk assessment instrument, that a marijuana arrest carried the same weight as a non-fatal assault of sorts when it comes to their opportunities for getting out. And so I think, you know, Georgia just started to make changes among those parts. And Georgia is one of those states where it's a 2 strikes. It's not a 3 strikes, right? And so they're one of the more punitive states, but they also saw the impact of a holistic approach. So Bill, do you have any other comments about that maybe?
Just add a couple comments. Among the states that we're working on with the Council of Criminal Justice are a variety of them that kind of have this red, blue, purple kind of stuff. You know, Florida, South Carolina, Texas, California, New York, I mentioned. But I echo a point Thaddeus made in the presentation. In the roughly 8 that we've been able to finish our analysis on so far, the nature of the reforms are pretty consistent. Focus on treatment, focus on discretion, and issues like that. And so it's kind of hard to. And then the examples that we gave from New York and Georgia show, well, some things happen and they happen differentially. So I think we're at this point of building the data, the results across the states, and it's a little too early to generalize, other than the one point about the nature of reforms that have been implemented, that they're fairly common. There's a general focus on, you know, good things like treatment, addressing whether there's too much discretion for certain actors like parole boards or judges and that kind of stuff, and to kind of get a sense of whether or not that's going to increase or decrease disparity. It'll take a little more work. And again, echoing a point Thad made a moment ago, we're not yet finding evidence that there's contributions to increasing in disparity. So that's all I'd have to add to that.
Oh, that's a great point too, Bill. I think, you know, if now I'm speculating, this is just us rapping, right? This is not Dr. Jones, it's just Thad talking to you all. All right, let's put it that way. I think, you know, the approach that we saw is that, remember, they weren't contributing to disparity. And so maybe, you know, when we're talking about how do we prioritize, maybe the first step is to stop the bleeding. And then after we stop the bleeding, perhaps we can build from there. And so so if if I want to kind of read into it, it seems like that approach has been taken. But one thing that Bill and I say is that if you want to impact disparity, you have to focus on equity. And we've seen make policy that focus on that. We've seen places also with things like creating these drug courts. Also, we've seen that places have been passing laws to make sure you document the demographics of those individuals who are being processed. So you see a spirit of fairness and reform kind of reverberating throughout these states as well.
Sheriff Burkhead, I believe you're next to ask a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Justice Earls. And Thaddeus and William, thank you for an outstanding presentation. The end of your presentation really echoed what I and my colleagues have been saying. It's a multi-pronged approach. Law enforcement can't do it alone. We are championing these partnerships and co-responder models. So spot on with that. But early on with your statistics, I had a question about raise the age here in North Carolina, and if you have any data that suggests impact one way or the other, how has raise the age contributed to either the increase or decrease in the rates of incarcerations? And then another question I have is, what does alternatives to incarceration or restorative practices look like when we're addressing violent offenses? Thank you.
That I can comment on that. Sheriff Burkhardt, unfortunately, we're not covering juveniles, so we don't know raise the age. I know in Georgia there's legislation that's been proposed several years ago because I think Georgia's upper age is 17. But what we do know is that prison admissions for younger people are going down. So in general, nationwide and in most states that we've looked at, so that 18 to 24-year-old group, there's not been a big increase. Second, and we're doing some new work on this, we're in a number of states, we're able to track prison episodes of persons in that state, kind of a longitudinal history to count the number of unique people versus, in all the data we talked about today, it's an admission, which could be the same person over time. And then we're looking at birth cohorts to see what's happening to people born in 1982 is the first one, 87, 92. And we're beginning to see in some states less, and then we track people or estimate how many people were incarcerated through age 40. That's where our data allow. And we're beginning to see, consistent with your question, Sheriff Burkhardt, younger age cohorts have lower levels of imprisonment involvement than older age cohorts. Now, I know that's not answering your question directly, but at least in terms on the prison side, this is right now not like a big influx of the youngest folk. And in fact, as we cut across birth cohorts and go to the more recent ones, which are younger people, their sort of 40-year level lifetime, 40-year imprisonment probabilities are going down. So we take that as kind of good news that younger kids, younger folk aren't being involved in the deep end of the criminal justice system as much.
No, thank you, Bill. I mean, and you definitely great response. So, like, that a lot of things we're still trying to figure out. And then just to comment on the latter half of you said, what does this holistic, I believe, approach look like? And so of course, even when you start talking about those policing strategies, it involves increased availability, but intelligent-led targeting. With crime analysis and mapping. And I know you know these things, right? I'm preaching not to the choir, but to the pastor, right? And it's better than those stop and frisk aspects. But you start looking at these other things, like focused deterrence and place network investigations. It's targets, it's data driven, and we really rely on the community to be co-producers of solutions for crime. And so I think also too, what we've seen in some places, and you know better than I do, that oftentimes with these place-based approaches, it's not just a place is not criminogenic 24 hours a day, right? We have this thing of over-policing, right? It's this delicate balance we have to strike. But that now we start looking at not only place but time, and focus on these places and times when they're most susceptible to violence and At the end of this thing that we're going to share with you, I have the presentation. I have things about Eastlake. I have some policing community strategies that you have access to with links to the data and to the references that I hope would be helpful. And you always can have my number, and we can wrap and talk to as well if you think it might be helpful. So thank you for your question, and thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Henderson, I think you're next. You're muted.
Hello. Thank you, Thad and Bill. Appreciate it. Data makes a difference, and I was really appreciative of the numbers as well as I could follow them. And I look forward to seeing in paper so I can review it more carefully. But I guess I have two things to say. One is 40 years ago, when I became a public defender, there were scores and scores of programs available for violent offenders. And it wasn't that people looked at violent offenders necessarily as three-headed monsters. They were seen as people who had mental health issues, drug and alcohol issues, and there were programs to deal with it. You had a youth act, you had youthful offender programs, and so there was an effort, underfunded even then, to deal with these core problems. That was in 1980, and probably not a surprise to anyone. Before the decade was out, all of those programs were ended. And so, today, 40 years later, we've got great data crunchers, academicians, policy folks, and universities, but we don't have the ability to pass laws and to change and undo what swept the nation 40 years ago. And I guess my plea is, how do we recognize that violent offenders is where the conversation has to be, and the fact that it is a racial disparity in offending that has to be addressed, when no one's willing to do that because they've got to deal with the political consequence of 24-hour cable news, and if it leads, it bleeds. Because when you say that we've got to stop the bleeding, what that tells the political person is, well, we've got to lock them up for longer and longer periods of times. And that's in conflict with the data. So, part of this is a plea for help trying to sort of translate this research to policymakers, both in the executive branch and the legislature and the courts. North Carolina, we have only one branch of government that we can talk to, and that's the executive branch. And we've got habitual offender laws. We have all of these things that multiply the length of time, and we have very little ability to change that. And I wonder if there are efforts in any of the other states that might be looked at. I know folks are trying in DC. They're doing some experimental things in DC. I understand Connecticut and Boston and Massachusetts. How can we deal with this need to address violent crime where we've got to go to politicians who are going to be much more reactive to media outrage?
Yeah, spot on. Just to add to the story, I think if you look even at federal grants in the 90s, like drug courts to drill with treatment, they precluded use of federal money for people convicted of violent offenses. Now, on the federal side, I don't know how far this is going to go. They're trying to relax that a little bit. So as they're saying, well, just because somebody has a conviction for a violent offense, look at it, see what it was. Maybe, It could have been an assault without a weapon. It could have been a bar fight, that kind of stuff. But in practice, in studies we have in several sites, in practice, it's hard for people to overcome that and that view at the local level, whether it's a prosecutor or whether it's a judge or whatever, to bring people into treatment that they're needed. So I'm adding to your I'm echoing your point about the diagnosis of the problem. I think though that on the solution side, some of we've talked, Thaddeus and I've talked about this, is like getting these points out. Like Thaddeus made the point that people age out of crime. So excessively long sentences don't necessarily add to public safety. And I don't want to, I mean, a pragmatic approach to this is sort of saying, well, you can continue to lock somebody up and think about it in terms of vengeance, but how much do you want to pay for that beyond some year? And I realize this is an incremental approach, whereas in the 80s and 90s, when the sentencing reforms changed, they were dramatic, 2 strikes, 3 strikes, and all that. But to your point about the politics, people need some kind of cover, and so maybe some kind of incrementalist way is to can be useful by appealing to the costs of this when it's not going to prevent any violent crime when a guy is 60 years old or anything like that. And I go back to the point, federal leadership. I'm not sure the feds lead. I think they learn from the states, and then the feds claim victory. As a former director of a federal agency saw on the ground, I think they tend to follow the states. But even if they're following the states, they can send signals. So a more, particularly under this administration, a more forward stance about treatment programs for all persons, and including people who've committed violent crimes, would be a good signal to send forward. And let the feds take some of the heat that is going to come, as you're saying, but and backing it up with data, not just stuff we have, but that other folk have generated also about these impacts. I want to also flip, and then this is going to turn to you, Thad. I think Thad and I believe that the justice system is important, but it's not quite the tail of the dog. It's a little bit more than that, but it isn't the dog. The main dog is community investment, developing communities, and addressing what causes people to engage in violent crime. And sometimes in discussions of criminal justice reform, there's a lost sight. It loses sight on that part. And I think politically that's very viable on both sides, or how many sides of the aisle there are these days. And so I think that has to go into these discussions about the positive impact of investing in communities while addressing Thaddeus's point with the Eastlake example, that is not just places, people. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
No, that's a great point, and Henderson, thank you so much, because this is what we're dealing with. This is our frustration. The justice system is underfunded. These resources are underfunded, and the truth is, the problem with just laying the facts bare, it makes it sound like it's only a Black problem. And if it's just a Black problem, why should the majority care, right? And so, just yesterday, when it presented something very similar but more intensive to congressional staffs. And so at least, like it's a one-off and we're beating the drum. But I think it's distilling the information and telling the full story, right? Telling the pros and cons, calling balls and strikes. I also think, how do you make it not seem like it's simply a Black issue? Well, take Atlanta. Many businesses are either leaving Atlanta or their city, or taking their services otherwhere, or they won't come in to the city because this violent crime increase that we see. And so it's an economic impact on the city. It's an opportunity impact for the city. It has impacts on tourism dollars in many places. And so I think you're going to have to show that it's not just a Black issue. This is cutting into your pockets. And then you have to also, talk about that, yes, it's a disproportionately Black issue, but these things are going on. And we don't talk about things like domestic violence, right? And in these other aspects that we don't necessarily report in these data, but maybe there's racial differences or similarities, I'm not sure, in those areas. And so I think, we have to really personalize it. I mean, look, we're in the US and it's a great, great nation, but we have a history, and this history still impacts how we view things and how we govern. And so this not to sound hopeless or pessimistic, but it's a long-term approach beyond grassroots. And this is the thing, the federal government, I tell people, what can the feds do? Provide money and resources, because people on the ground are already doing things. The people in states are doing it. Nonprofits are doing it. Hell, and many times we don't know because these nonprofits don't even have the data infrastructure or don't have the money to pay somebody to come and show, look at what we're doing. These things can be scaled up. And so I think, you just take a more long-term approach, but, in this day and age, we want everything to happen in the microwave, and that's not how policy and how public safety works. So I didn't really answer your question. Just want you to know, basically, amen.
Can I ask you really quickly if you have a view on the Second Look Act movement that seems to be bubbling up in different states, and whether that can impact the racial disparities, particularly from those sentences that were imposed in the 80s and 90s, that era?
Yeah, you're right. Second Look Act is getting a lot of attention. I think the DC controversy with it has to deal with the youthful offenders and those issues. But I think that, yeah, that makes, I think that's a good point. I think the data, our data are showing that given admission, and this is the offending part, the kind of sentence lengths, and there's a little bit of, or the time served are pretty comparable. So a Second Look Act, what it would end up doing, it wouldn't necessarily change the disparity ratio for violent offending if white and black offenders who are subject to it are treated, get similar outcomes, but it would have a larger proportionate reduction in the number of black offenders given the disparity in violent offending, and that could contribute to some overall reduction in the disparity. But it goes to a point that we talk about people's lives. Like, if I think, okay, if I'm left out, if I'm in prison for 30 years and I'm 50 versus 40 years and I'm 60, what's that extra 10 years going to do? It's not going to change my behavior. And you start thinking it of the issue in that way. Okay, is that a common is that approach that could be viable? I think that has some salience, but then the depressing side of it is when I think of compassionate release laws that are in play, very few people get released under that mechanism, federally or in the data that are available in the states. And this is a group of people who are not necessarily 50 and healthy, but 60 or older and not healthy. So that gets us back into the box that you raised at the outset of how can we have a conversation about people who've committed violent crimes, who've been sentenced and served a lot of time in prison, and make some reasonable decisions about responding to those conditions and dealing with any single, quote, Willie Horton thing that might arise without derailing the whole enterprise. And yeah.
This has been so incredible. We are already way over time, but I have to recognize one last question from Nisha Williams, who's sitting here with me. She's been waiting patiently. So Nisha, go ahead.
And you did bring it up briefly, Thad, but the question I had was if you did have any data points relating to the number of violent crimes associated with domestic violence, because in the work that I do, we very much see that prevention around domestic violence includes some of these things that you talked about: education, housing, just providing that adequate resources. And so I was just wondering generally if you all had any data points related to the number of assaults, the number of violent crimes, which of those were related to domestic violence, because it could, again, continue to support the needs to help families in conflict with all of these other external resources.
You know, that's a good
No, go
a
ahead.
good question. And Bill, and Bill, I want you to jump in because I know you've done some work like maybe locally. I didn't see, so, you know, the data that we were using, it didn't allow us to break it down, the national data in the state to break it down in that regard. But what we did see across some of the states were provisions, statutory provisions targeting domestic violence offenders, particularly habitual offenders and things of this nature, but also beyond targeting the offender, they have provisions for family court and these things, that holistic approach that we're talking about. And, you know, the domestic violence issues is a big issue. First of all, you know, it's hard to police domestic violence as opposed to other aspects, right? And so that makes data a little bit harder. But I think that's one of those dark figures or hidden areas that goes not talking about it, particularly during the pandemic when we're kind of all stuck in the house together, and it shifted the criminal market both on the street and in our homes. And so you're absolutely right. No, Bill, I know you may have more insight with that with some work you've done in Georgia, but you want to jump in on that?
No, not much to add to that, except we can get you those data from the National Crime Victimization Survey. It's not state specific, but nationally. And I think North Carolina participates in NIBRS, and we can dig through some of that to dig up some of the information on domestic violence. And at least the ones that are reported to police and all that. But we didn't get that specific in the analysis we did so far.
Yeah, and just to echo that, so please just email us, and y'all have our information, and we're willing to just to be a resource. And we believe in the work that you're doing. It really aligns with what we're doing, and so it's just a whole concerted effort. So, you know, this hopefully is not the last time. Hopefully we partner, because this is what's really needed to kind of push this forward. Unfortunately, you know, we're still dealing with this, even though we have the answers. You know, how can we put into action, and can we fund them? And that's really the big question.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you for the presentation and for the information you're getting to us, and we will be taking you up on the offer to contact you. I had a few more questions, but thank you for your time. We've burdened you more than we said we would, so we'll let you go, and we'll wrap up the rest of our meeting. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
So our next step is to hear briefly from the committees who have short reports for us. And I'm going to start with the Judicial Committee. Judge Thornburg, can you give us a quick update?
Sure. Briefly, it's my understanding that the Division of Adult Corrections legislative staff, some of you are here, I think, have met with leadership of the appropriate committees in the legislature to continue scheduling the reentry simulation. And I don't think it's going to happen exactly when we had hoped, but my understanding is those talks are ongoing. We continue to work to identify educational opportunities and training opportunities for judges and court employees with regard to the ability to pay and fines and fees issues, as well as continue to seek opportunities for equity training in that area. Continue to work with the State Bar with regard to CLE credit for diversity, inclusion, and elimination of bias training. I think Emily is here, and there's overlap with our committees with regard to gaining additional data and approaches to achieve representative juries. So that's something that's important to the committee. We continue to work on that. I want to welcome Tisha Williams, who I believe is there with Justice Earls as my co-chair. She is the director of the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and we're honored that she has been willing to serve in this role. And now I'll ask if there's anything else from other committee members that you'd like to share. All right, that was quick. Justice Earls.
Well, thank you very much. No, that's really helpful. Next, I want to turn to the Legislative Committee. Senator Mohammed.
Thank you so much, Justice Earl. Thank you so much to us, the task force, and our guest speakers. Again, I'm Mushabah Mohammed, representing Mecklenburg County 38 Senate District, chair of the Legislative Committee. I serve with Representative Marshall Morey, Chief Jennings, and Sheriff Burkhead on the Legislative Task Force. So just a quick update, since the Legislative Committee wasn't able to meet in January at the planning meeting, we did meet on February 3rd to begin thinking about all the things that we wanted to work out. I know Chief Jennings discussed some legislation related to pretrial and bail policy initiatives. We also had a robust discussion on the role of school resource officers. I know that was also important to Sheriff Burkhead. We also discussed other pending legislations related to red flag laws and state storage initiatives. I did want to share an exciting announcement with our task force that our committee has come up with the idea of a virtual bipartisan panel discussion, a learning series on criminal justice reform in a bipartisan fashion. The initial panel will be on April 18th at 10 a.m. Secretary Buffalo will do our welcome. I'll be facilitating with some other subject matter experts, some questions from both sides of the aisle. And we're looking forward to sharing that information about that event to you closer to the date. But thank you, Justice Earls.
Oh, thank you. That's great. And then Mike Hawkins, the local committee.
All right. Thank you, Justice Earls. And hello, everyone. Good morning, everyone. A couple of things I would say about the local committee. The first thing would be that in TREC 1.0, we were really lucky with the local committee in that we had members of the committee as well as all the staff support members. They weren't just members, they were very engaged and very involved and very excited about what we were trying to do. And it's still early days, but we already see that we're just as blessed in TREC 2.0 with the staff and with the members. They are just as engaged and excited about trying to get these things accomplished. We've had a couple of meetings. We've kind of broken our work down into 4 areas, general areas. One being law enforcement outreach, including the model policy work that we've already been doing, trying to expand upon that. Also, the law enforcement advisory group, the work that group does is so important to us. A second area, it's kind of a new area for us, is looking more at how can we engage at the grassroots level, not just with elected officials, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but with grassroots organizations around the state. And to that end, we've kind of stolen Kerwin. Kerwin Pittman has been gracious enough to help us. He's chair of another committee, but he is also helping us think that through. And we're kind of starting from scratch with that, maybe even starting to the point of saying we need to just basically map out the ecosystem there to understand the players in this area and how we might be able to engage with them regionally and on a statewide level. So the third area is with local leaders. We've been very engaged over the past couple of years with local leaders, and we're expanding that. Our work has been largely with elected officials on the county level, and thanks to Mayor Blakely, who is a member of our committee, he's made real connections with us with the League of Municipalities, and we've already had a meeting with them and are excited about potentials with the league and with the mayors in trying to implement and promote some of these TREC recommendations. The final thing I'll mention is another new thing that's really conceptual now, and we don't know where it will go, if anywhere. But we've had a lot of conversation in this past month with our group about Tyre Nichols and the situation in Memphis, and our perception that a big part of the failure in Memphis was not policy related, it was culture related. And so we're starting to have a conversation about, are there ways that we can engage constructively on the local level with local organizations to talk about culture? Because one thing that we've heard repeatedly with the Law Enforcement Advisory Group is, and the phrase keeps getting repeated, we've heard it a number of times, that is culture eats policy for lunch. And so if you have policies that are contrary to internal culture, it really makes it difficult sometimes for the policies to win out. So we're doing those things. I would say also very quickly that we're also engaged with the alternative, with the Reimagining 911, as well as to the point of Dr. Johnson's point about holistic, really looking into trying to promote a couple of the recommendations from TREC in terms of education and school systems with mental health professionals, with social service professionals, physical health professionals, and try and work with that with local officials to get those implemented. So a lot of things generally, but the biggest thing is we've got, Justice Earls, we've got a great group of people on our committee. We really do, and we're excited.
Well, thank you for that report. And I'm excited about all of our committees and all of our committee leadership. So thank you all for those reports. The executive committee did not have a chance to meet, but they'll be meeting in the coming weeks, and we'll hear from them at our next full meeting. So we've had one person to sign up to speak during our public comment section. So I want to make sure we get that in. And so we now have, we're opening up for public comment, and we have a representative of Voices for the Silenced. Phoenix, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself, and you have 2 minutes to give us your input.
There we go. Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, you can't see me, but that could be a good thing. Sorry, I'm still technologically challenged. So as long as you can hear me, I guess that's good. First off, congratulations on TREC 2.0. With the time constraints, I'm going to be incredibly direct because I don't assume I could take the other 4 slots and use a whole 10 minutes. So in my 2-minute time frame, just don't take it as being rude. In support of all that you guys are doing, I created Voices for the Silenced, Larry's Story. It's a YouTube video, okay? It was my way to offer you an opportunity to see in real time one Black kid's 50 years and counting journey while he's been trapped inside the North Carolina criminal justice system, all right? I realize that you're aware of the racial inequities, but I was aiming to show you how the injustices are now addressing, that I'm now addressing, have happened, and how they can snowball, how judges and courts have not held accountable those complicit in allowing for this to continue. I was hoping that you could use Larry's story as a litmus test for each of your committees, that as you begin to create the strategies on how to implement your goals, asking, you know, would this have helped Larry? If it's yes, then you're on the right track. If no, maybe you could tweak something, not that it would help him in any way, but that it could help future generations from becoming ensnared in what is still a corrupt system. I sent an email to everyone on the TREC roster back in May because I wanted to know that, you know, you guys to know that it was out there and available. I honestly believe that if you can see, and his story has been condensed to 32 minutes, 50 years and counting. And he's not even at the present time in the court system seeking to challenge his unconstitutional as well as wrongful conviction. He is just seeking a resentencing hearing. I had questions for the Juvenile Sentencing Review Board in ways to apply and how to contact them. I contacted the clemency office. They never responded, even though 3 times I asked if the JSRB had a specific email which would allow people to connect with them directly if they have issues in applying. The video is the only reason I wanted to do this is because I wanted to make you all aware that the video is out there. It's available to you. It was directed at TREC and the governor, so that you would be aware that this stuff not only has been going on for 50 years, but it's continuing present day.
Well, thank you so much. We have run out of time. I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you for making this information available to us. And so
Justice Earls,
yes.
I just wanted to say, Phoenix, I'll send you my email address and you can definitely reach out to me if you need to reach the governor's clemency office. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
So we are at the end of our meeting time. New business, if there's any issues, comments, reflections, anything that any task force member wants to bring to the attention for the good of the whole, you have the floor. Is there anything anyone wants to share? Secretary Bryant, Assistant Secretary Bryant.
Thank you, Justice Earls. I'm sorry I had to walk away and before when I wanted to make a comment, and I've been back for the wrap up. But I had wanted to make a comment in response to some about the options of what we could do as it relates to violent crime, and just wanted to mention that sometimes I feel like we make things much more complicated than they have to be, because there are some excellent efforts going on in several, I would say, I'm reluctant to say many without a count, local communities where there are collaborations, for example, between hospitals, law enforcement, community supervision, local government, mental health, social services, all the key players to look at responding to violent crime and CBOs, and how to help create a network among all the key players in conjunction with other funded programs like the diversion and reentry programs and the MAT programs in the sheriff's offices, etc. And I think if we sort of document that model and help, and there are lots of communities looking for an opportunity and some support. Of course, everybody wants funding and staffing and all of that, but there are often even local entities, for example, like health systems, where there could be investments. And if we were, it would be good to get that going. So when we expand Medicaid, we be in a position to take advantage of those additional health services that will be available and should change how things are happening in local jails and on reentry. So I just throw that out there. I think there's a lot we can do, and some of it doesn't take a whole lot of resources, but somebody would have to lead, structure, organize, create a way that those communities that have resources and staffing, like at least Greensboro and Charlotte come to my mind, that those models could be used and to help others in other communities who would want to develop those kind of programs with the main key players, such as around this table. So district attorney's offices, all the main players. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Assistant Secretary Bryant, I appreciate that, and it makes a lot of sense. I did want to point out to the members that one thing, we've already tried to do a little bit of that work in terms of documenting the places across the state where some of these ideas are in place. I'm sure it's not comprehensive, but we did our best, and just wanted to remind folks that we have a local implementation map on the TRIC website that identifies some of those places. And if people and members are aware of other places that need to be added to that map, you can certainly let staff know. And that's going to be an ongoing effort. But I hear you that local collaboration is something that we want to, when things are working well, one of the things this task force can do is help export that and share that elsewhere.
Yes, and some coordination and collaboration of that, much like we have done with the reentry movement, such that it is pretty much statewide at this point. There are very few communities where there isn't something going on around reentry. So I think the same thing, or maybe we could combine those efforts in some way. So thank you.
No, thank you for that. And we should definitely follow up. Does anyone else have any? Oh, yes, Kerwin.
Good morning, everybody. Real quick, I see Phoenix is still in the attendance room, and I want to just implore to please resend the email to me, Kerwin Pittman, so I can take a look at the material you compiled and put together. And thank you for compiling and putting it together.
Does anyone else have anything? Well, great. Well, so you've all got the word about April 18th at 10 a.m. for the bipartisan panel, but also remember that our next quarterly Force meeting will be Friday, April 21st. It'll be from 1 to 3 p.m. So make sure you put that on your calendars. And I'm a little bit late adjourning, but I really want to thank all of you for your time today, for all the work you've been doing in between our meetings. And I just really appreciate all of you for your commitment, and we'll keep moving forward. Thank you.